Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's been a few weeks since my last post, and if this background looks a little different to you, that's because it's coming to you from the basement of my new house in Tennessee. We finally made it. Now, the trip out here was disastrous, to put it mildly. We ran into nothing but problems, but that is an issue for a future video, and that one will be worth the watch because it was rough. Now this video is going to be the next step in the F-350 Supercab resto-mod build. And because I'm already in Tennessee, that means that the truck is already finished. So I have been working basically from 7 a.m. to midnight every single day since the last video that I've posted. And I've had enough time to film, but I haven't had enough time to edit. So what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, probably 8 to 10 weeks to be honest, is spreading out the videos and trying to make them a little bit better, because I was very unhappy with how the Dana 60 disc brake conversion video came out. It was just a little bit rushed and I just didn't like it. So I'm trying to kind of get everything back on track here. Now, where we left off was finishing up the disc brake conversion, front and rear. The frame was all good. The suspension was complete except for the front leaf springs, which I was still waiting on from, I think it was Skyjacker. So let's jump right in to tearing down that motor and getting it ready to get into the truck. Alright guys, I'm going to start here by removing both of the belts. The first one uses a proper tensioner. The second one uses the alternator style tensioner, where it's got the one bolt on the back and then it swings. Next up is the alternator bracket and then the air pump. And this air pump will not be reused, so I'll just do a new sized belt for the alternator. And then over here, I'm taking off the air conditioning compressor, which will of course be replaced when I do the new vintage air kit. And then the cap and electronics for the multi-port fuel injection that is not going to be used. So I can just throw all the electronics away. Next up is the power steering and air conditioning bracket. I took that off in one piece with the power steering pump still on it. And then the water pump. Now, this is normally not that difficult to remove. You know, you just remove all the bolts for it, it pops right off. But there is a tremendous amount of corrosion. And when aluminum corrodes, it creates this nasty white powder. And so some of the bolts were breaking off, and some of them were just needing a whole bunch of extra work. So I kept using a hammer to kind of shock load the bolts to see if I could wiggle them out, because I was trying to not break off any bolts in the block. And I was very lucky where the bolts broke off at the head and not at the engine. So there was enough of them left once I pulled this off finally to get the studs out. So I ended up cutting all these rubber hoses and just kept working it until it finally gave in. Now I was not concerned about damaging the water pump or the timing cover at this point, because I had determined that both of them were going to need replacing. There's that white powder that you see at the bottom from the aluminum corrosion. Next up is the crank pulley. That was held in by just 3 bolts, and then it popped off. And then the harmonic balancer. And this is a weighted balancer with like a little rubber cushion in it to help tamper some of the vibrations of the engine. This is the heavy-duty oil cooler that came on the truck versions of this. I'm not sure if all the trucks had it or if it was an option, but there goes the dipstick. Next up, the exhaust manifold. Now if you remember, I already had one of the bolts was broken off in the engine, and I broke a couple more on its way out. Even though I tried to take my time, do it correctly, use some penetrating oil. I've got it. I think a PB Blaster is what I was using on this, but it just didn't matter. A couple of them were going to break, and there was nothing I could do about it. Oh, there goes the motor mounts. Those will be replaced with the conversion motor mounts. Alright guys, well the motor's getting awfully naked. The plan here is to take it down to a long block, but not any farther. So what I just did was I went through with my favorite screwdriver. Let me show it to you here. I love this thing. It's so old. You can see how the tip is all worn out. But this is the best for like adjusting carburetors. And in this case, getting all these little cruddies out. What I want to do is get all the crud that's right where the heads mate to the intake manifold, because I'm going to pull this intake manifold off and I don't want all these crumbs falling in there. So I also scraped along the edge here to kind of get all the crumbs that are on that seal between the valve covers and the head. So the idea is just kind of go over the whole thing, pull any of these little crumbies that I can get to around the distributor in this little area, because it's pretty much sealed right now still. The injectors are still plugged. I mean, you could get a little bit in there. All of the water jackets are exposed, but overall, I'm not going to be getting any crumbs anywhere near anything that's going to cause damage for it. So I'm going to get my air compressor going, blow off all this little dirt and crummies, and then start to disassemble this further down to the long block. So let's get to it. Now, I showed you guys in a previous episode what it looked like under one of the valve covers. It's very clean. One of the areas that I look for is anywhere where little bits of oil can accumulate, like the tops of these little X's here. And this is where the little sludge and the buildup can happen, because all of the oil ends up in here, and then it all drains down through these little galleys here. So anything that pools oil will end up getting super gunky if you don't change the oil on time. But this looks really good inside. Everything I'm looking at makes me very happy. Now, I went over to the machine shop to talk about getting these exhaust bolts taken out. Now, the two on this side, these should be no big deal. What I would normally do is just heat it up with a little blowtorch and then use vice grips, but somebody suggested putting a nut over it and then welding the nut onto it so that I can use a proper wrench, and boy, that's a wonderful idea. So I can do that for these four, 1, 2, and then the 2 on the other side. The problem is going to be this one here, this one here. I don't think I have the ability to remove those. Let me show you what I've got as far as extractors go. So here's the extractors that I use. I've got one set up there, and I've got another set here. They're pretty basic. You can see they're just threaded. They look like they're threaded in reverse so that you drill a hole into whatever you're trying to remove, and then you are able to kind of hammer it in, and then you use, the end has a square head, so you use the same tap and die little square tool to remove them. The problem is, let me see if I can show you. Here's one. The problem is this happens. So these are obviously hardened steel, so you have to have a drill bit that's strong enough to drill into the hardened bolt, and then you've got this hardened steel that goes in and tries to remove it. And the problem with hardened steel is that the harder it gets, the more brittle it becomes. So you have to be very careful to not break them. Though I don't think I can get those out, and I talked to the machine shop and they said that they can't get them out unless I pull the heads off. So right now we're looking at pulling these heads off and then having them mill down the bottom, and then clean it all up, do a cylinder leak down check, all that stuff, and then pull out those studs so that I can be working on other stuff. So that's probably what we're gonna do. Alright guys, so I sprayed a little penetrating oil onto the bolts. Right now the bolts are very hot, so they've expanded, and the block is room temperature, so it's staying the same normal size, and that is the exact opposite situation of what we want. What we want is the block to be very hot and then the bolt itself to be lower temperature. So I'm going to wait for these to cool down, and then I will use a blowtorch around the bolts to get that area hot. Once it's very hot, I'll spray a little dash of penetrating oil again back to where the bolt meets the block so that it will cool the bolt and hopefully lubricate those threads. Once I do that, and I see a whole bunch of steam coming up, I'll give it a shot and try to crack it free. If it works and it pulls out, good on me. If it doesn't, 25 bucks for each one that I mess up. So wish me luck. But look at this timing chain. Ready? Woo! Yikes. I mean, 142,000 miles, that's not a ton. Everything else on the motor internally looks really, really, really good. But boy, that chain is loose. So, good thing we're going to be replacing that with a new one. I don't know if you can see in there, but it looks very nice. No scoring, beautiful cross hatching. Alright guys, here's the heads. Cleaned and machined and ready to party. All the threads for the exhaust manifold. Nice and looking good. Alright guys, in this next segment I'm going to address why I decided to not rebuild this motor. And in doing so, I talk about the oil sample that came back from Blackstone Labs, but I forgot to record the information on it. Basically, everything was pretty good across the board with the exception of high levels of lead and high levels of iron. Now the lead was 4 times above normal and the iron was actually 10 times above normal, but in the actual parts per million, it was still relatively low overall, and it was right on that threshold to be worried about. So let me just take over from there. Alright guys, let's talk about when to rebuild a motor and when not to rebuild a motor. Now everybody's got a different opinion on this, it seems, and a lot of the people's opinions are based on who's paying for it, because a few people have said, I should just rebuild this motor, willy-nilly, like it's just free to rebuild a motor. Now, in this case, we had good oil pressure and we didn't have a rod knock, so we know that the bearings are good. But then we sent in the oil sample and it said that there was excessive lead and iron, indicating that the bearings are on their way out. So this is about as close to a razor's edge for making that call as to whether or not it should be rebuilt prior to there being an actual problem. Obviously, if there's a problem, you're going to have to rebuild the motor, but this was just right on that edge. So I went to the machine shop and talked to the guy there and showed him the oil sample report to get his opinion. He said if there's good oil pressure, it's not bouncing up and down, and it wasn't, and you're not having a rod knock, he goes, don't rebuild it. And that's a guy who professionally rebuilds motors. So this has really been the closest call that I've ever had. Usually there's either a rod knock, low oil pressure, or something like that. Now, I'm not scared of high mileage. Most of the vehicles that I've got are higher mileage. A lot of the vehicles that I build for the low-end builds, those are high mileage. The trophy truck has 131,000 miles. I've done personal builds, 180,000 miles on the Crown Vics, no problem, as long as the oil sample report comes back good. Now the reality is, up to a long block, all this is an air pump. That's it, just an air compressor. You've got an electric starter that starts spinning it, and its only job is to compress air. That's it. The fuel comes in elsewhere, the spark comes in elsewhere, all of the controls, those happen somewhere else. All it does is compress it. So as long as it's compressing it and it's getting proper fuel and spark, it's going to continue to run until you eliminate one of those. Now every other component on this is going to be replaced. You're going to have a new fuel injection system, you're going to have a new ignition system, you're going to have an entire new front drivetrain. We're going to be changing out this loosey-goosey timing chain. So hopefully that gives you an idea on my perspective for when to do a rebuild and when not to do a rebuild. I guess the next step is just going to be jump right into this thing. Now, as far as prepping a short block for the heads have been machined and they've been cleaned, so they're good to go. All I had to do to the block, and this was the recommendation from the guys at the machine shop, I just say, hey, I'm building this, what should I do? They said take a razor blade to the top, make sure it's as clean as can absolutely be, get the razor blade at 90 degrees, go across everything, make sure it's just as clean as you can get it. All of the little gasket materials are off, that kind of thing. I went through each of the pistons, cleaned off the carbon, and then I used seafoam with a toothbrush just to kind of get in all those corners, and then I used compressed air to get any little carbon buildup that happened around the rings. I went ahead and rotated it to top dead center so I could change out my timing chain. So the next step is going to be to put these head gaskets on and then get this timing chain cleaned up. Now there were a little bit of gasket material and little kind of boogers that made their way down into the oil pan, and there probably has been a little dust or something that's made its way through up here. So the plan is still to remove the oil pan, make sure that the oil pan is absolutely spick and span, put the front timing cover on, and then I can do the oil pan with a new proper gasket. And that'll make sure that everything is nice and clean and we are good to go. Now for the head bolts, these are not torque to yield or stretch bolts. These are just standard old school bolts. The guys at the machine shop recommended that I reuse them. They said just send them through the wire wheel to make sure that they're nice and clean. So that's what I intend on doing. So let's get the Fel-Pro gaskets on. In this case I'm going with the 520 SDs. Those are the severe duty head gasket for the 460s and they're recommended for truck applications. So let's get to it. Hey everybody, this is Ted. Ted, is this the first engine you've ever built? Mm-hmm. Are you excited?
Yeah.
All right, how do we put this together? I don't even know.
Put the bolts in.
Oh, good idea. All right, now, we already have the cylinder heads on. Ted, these are the cylinder heads, this and this right here. Now the cylinder heads are gonna have to be bolted into the engine block.
Look at these screws.
Good bolts.
Tall.
All right, hop up here, I'll give you the bolts and you can put them in one at a time.
Hey, what's that?
That's oil. I'll explain that in a second. So on the cylinder head bolts, you want to dip them in oil. Do you know why?
Why?
Because we're going to have to torque these down with a special tool, and when we torque them down, we don't want any friction buildup on the threads to cause an incorrect torque reading. So slide that in, and then turn it.
This way?
That's right. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. There we go. You want to see a super cool tool? You've never used this before? Watch this. Ready?
What is it doing?
Pretty cool, huh? It tightens the bolts.
I'm gonna try.
Sure. Go for it. Try this one. There you go.
What else do I do with the other one?
It loosens it. Do you know what this is called? It's called a torque wrench. There's a couple rules about this wrench. First rule.
How does that work? But we never saw what it looks like.
Oh yeah, here it is. So the rules about this: you never drop this, because if you drop it, it won't work anymore. You have to go get it tested. The other rule is, you see these numbers here? When you're done using it, you unscrew this every time and bring it back to 0. That way it doesn't get out of its settings. So we're going to go to 80. You see 80 right there? So I'm going to turn until the 0 is right there on the 80, and then I tighten the bottom here. And this is 80 pound-feet of torque. That's a lot. That's more than double what you weigh. Now we have to do these in a special order. We want to start in the middle so that it holds it really tight in the middle, and then we work our way out. If you start from the outside and you go down, it can twist and it can warp the head. Even though it's two pieces of heavy metal, they can still get twisted just slightly. So we're going to start right here. Do you know how you know when you're tight enough? So you're going to listen for a clicking noise, okay? And you'll know it when you hear it. Listen. Heard it? There it is. So that's the first one we do. Now this is this takes a ton of energy. So I'm gonna have you, once it gets tight, I'm gonna get your help. So, here, hop down for a second. Come over here on this side. And you're gonna put your hand right here. There you go. And you're gonna pull down real slowly until we hear that clicking noise. Whoa, that was a lot, huh?
That's super tight. There's 2 clicks.
That's super tight. Yeah, one of the clicks is on its way down, and one of the clicks is when you release it. All right, go back up. All right, ready? And then let go. There it is. All right. All right, now the next setting is going to be 100. So we're going to go ahead and screw this up, tighten it all up. Now watch this time. It's only going to move just a teensy tiny little bit. See? All we're doing. It moves more than 80 because it's tighter. Alright guys, it's time to install the timing chain. Now it's very straightforward. You've got one bolt on the camshaft and that's it. The bottom gear slides on the crank because it's on that Woodruff key, and of course the camshaft is keyed, you see with that one hole. The only thing I wanted to point out, if you notice here, this is the new crank gear, and it has 3 different positions for that Woodruff key. And if you look closely, you can see this little circle here. It's lined up with the tooth exactly on the Woodruff key. This one here is a little bit offset, and then this one here is a little bit offset the other direction. So one of them will be retarded, one of them will be advanced. I don't know off the top of my head which is which. I think the earlier generations of these motors were pretty retarded, and so people would want to advance them when they did the gears. But in this case, because this is the very last iteration of this motor, I'm going to put it back in its factory location, which is this one right here, the little circle. So that's it. All right, guys, much tighter. Alright guys, it's time to talk about this intake manifold. Now, you saw me take this off, but you didn't see me clean it. The only thing that I've done so far is sprayed it with a nice degreaser and then hit it with the old pressure washer. Now you can tell the aluminum, it's seen some age, and if I were to throw this back on the motor, it just wouldn't look quite right. Now, the proper way to clean this would be to use like a sandblasting machine, but instead of using sand as the medium, you would actually use CO2 pellets. So it's a, it's a frozen gas that hits it, and then it breaks off all the little gunk, and then it sublimates and it leaves you with no residue outside of what you've removed. That's what's used to clean out like the inside of stainless steel tanks used in food processing. Obviously I don't have one of those. I have this old Harbor Freight sandblaster. Now if I were to put this in there on top of getting sand into little bits and pieces and then putting a nice rough edge on some of the gaskets, it would end up just beating the hell out of it, and it would still be discolored. And I can tell you that because I've tried it back in the day. So I told myself I would never sandblast another one of these to make them look good. So I will show you, let me see, where did I put it? Hang on just a second, let me find it. This is what I'm going to be using. This is VHT, flame-proof ceramic coating. Now this particular color is flat aluminum, and the reason that I'm going to be using this, even though these are not headers or something requiring the, what temperature rating is this, 1300 degrees, this is the closest spray paint I have ever found to that cast aluminum look, because it has enough ceramic in it to give it a nice little sparkle, and it looks like just freshly made cast aluminum. It's about, I think it's 11 bucks, so it's not too cheap, but that's what I'm going to use, and it's going to look nice and sharp. Now, a few people pointed out in the first episode where I got the 460 that you can't just bolt on a carburetor onto this. It has a different
it has a different mount because of the upper plenum. Now, luckily for me, Price Motorsports makes an adapter, and this is what it will look like. Now, you might be wondering about these 8 injector ports. What do you do about that? Well, the kit comes with brass plugs, and then it comes with some bolts for mounting it and gaskets. Now, what's kind of cool is it's a husband and wife team that actually makes these. Mary is who I dealt with. She actually machines these herself on top of answering the phones and handling all the shipping. She is quite a lady. Now, they don't have the ability to purchase those online. You do have to call them up. They are a little bit old school, but it's kind of cool because they're so friendly. So let's get this thing painted, and I'm not going to show you that because it's very boring. We're just going to do, let's see how quickly we can do this. Ready? 1, 2, 3, boom! Look at that. Now, you're crazy if you don't think that looks like a brand new cast aluminum intake manifold. Now, I was thinking when I was painting this that you could put this on a cast iron intake manifold and you could make it look aluminum. That would be cheating, of course. Now, the next step is going to be putting these little plugs in to each of the injector ports, and then it'll be ready to go on the motor as soon as the motor's ready to accept it. Alright guys, that's going to be it for the motor build. I forgot to videotape some of putting it together, like the final drive assembly on the front and the power steering bracket. I think I didn't film it because I had to order a new timing cover, and the timing cover got super delayed, and then I had to get timing cover bolts, and so by the time I finally got everything together, I just kind of threw it together. But to me, that's not super exciting to look at anyways. But because this project is already done, I can actually show you some snippets of future episodes so you guys can have an idea of a little sneak peek of how it turned out. I was super happy with this build. So I'll go ahead and show those to you now, and then the next episode of the truck build will almost certainly be in 2 weeks. And well, 2 weeks from yesterday, 2 weeks from Saturday. Saturdays, every 2 weeks is when I'm going to try and have videos come out. But I might have a video next week of this move because it was a disaster, like I said, and I think that that's worth trying to squeeze in that video. So next week, move. Week after that, truck. Here's some snippets. See you guys soon. Take care. This thing is mean. Oh, get the AC going.
Oh, it says AC?
Yeah. Thank you. 79, that's right. Thanks.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.
They're flying down the track, they're like, "Rah!" And that's just tons of explosions. Explosion, 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 explosion. And this has to hold every one of those explosions. And if it doesn't hold the explosion, the bolts break, the head lifts off, and the engine explodes.